your resume, is extraordinary. You have really achieved so much. I mean, graduate from Harvard Law School and you know, Berkeley, California, and you have this extraordinary career at Human Rights Watch. So it puts you really in the forefront of human rights issues. This is going to be the first of a few, I hope, series of interviews that I'd like to have with you. Recently, on July 17th, you tweeted something about the death of Morsi in Egypt. That was the 1-year anniversary. And since then, it looks like the situation in Egypt has gone from bad to worse.
I mean, I think Egypt is in the throes of an absolute crisis. It's a crisis of terror at the hands of a government that emerged in a military coup to crush a democratic movement that had produced the first and only democratically elected president in Egypt's modern history, and now is such a paranoid government that has so little actual support among its public that it rules with the means of fear and terror. And that's why the numbers of Egyptians who have been arrested, detained, harassed, intimidated, their property confiscated, and so forth, has so dramatically expanded. Initially, of course, during the beginning of the coup, they focused on Islamists or people associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, but it was very soon after that that they expanded into all of those who supported the original revolution in 2011 against President Hosni Mubarak, which of course was not just Islamist, but was very much a mix of secular, liberal, Salafi. I mean, there were a whole variety of people who wanted to see the downfall of the Mubarak government, and miraculously brought about a largely bloodless revolution, at least bloodless by the hands of the revolutionaries. The only blood that was spilled was at the hands of the government. And, so this is a government that has now, the stars have aligned, because not only are they themselves implementing and imposing their rule on the people, they have the support of two of the biggest powers in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which of course helped finance and support the coup and continue to support and prop up the Egyptian government to maintain control over the possibility of any new democratic movement in the country. And on top of that, since President Trump's election, the United States has moved from what I think can most charitably be described as a neutral position on democracy in Egypt to one of open hostility towards the Egyptian people and total support for their authoritarian rulers, encapsulated by the words of President Trump, who was very open and honest in describing General Sisi as his favorite dictator. So no one's pretending that this is democracy. No one's pretending this is a nice government that has the best interests of the people. This is openly recognized and talked about as a dictatorship whose only role is to stifle the voices of its own people.
Right. Well, the role of the United States during the Mubarak years seemed to be almost benign and almost encouraging of a revolution, actually. I remember Obama and Secretary Clinton were actually kind of not pushing for a revolution, but asking almost. Wouldn't you say? I mean, that was a huge reversal.
Yeah. I think it was certainly not pushing for a revolution. I think what started as an effort to push for democratic reforms in the Middle East really started under George Bush, the prior president, and Condoleezza Rice, who made it their mission in sort of almost backtracking to justify the invasion of Iraq on the grounds of establishing democracy, to say, well, we want this everywhere, all over the Middle East.
Right.
And so when they ended up pressing Mubarak to liberalize and open and democratize in the country. He did so in 2006, and that resulted, of course, in about 130 Egyptian Brotherhood members joining the parliament. And he thought that would scare off the Americans, saying, oh yeah, you want democracy? Here's your democracy. Is that what you want? Of course, the exact same thing happened in the West Bank and Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority, under pressure, was forced to democratize. And the minute that it did, Hamas gained control of the elections. And of course, there was an attempted coup in Gaza led by Mr. Dahlan, who's now working for the UAE government. No surprises there. And that failed. So I think that the Mubaraks of this world and others very smartly tried to show them that a United States and other Western states that, well, actually be careful what you wish for, because if we democratize, the Islamists are coming, and the Islamophobia in the United States and in Western countries was very effectively manipulated against democratic voices.
And then encouraged so by countries like the United Arab Emirates, and beginning to designate everything that has political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, as being the evil that needed to be quashed at all costs. Because actually they are represented in a lot of parties throughout North Africa and the Middle East. I mean, for one thing, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Jordan, in a lot of places. The idea was that there is no reconciliation with those parties, where in fact we know that in places like Europe, they had to do with their Christian Democrats and their Christian this and their Christian that. So the mere word Islamic or party became sort of synonymous with terrorists, and so of course that was an easy sell for the Europeans, and it continues to this day. So since Morsi's overthrow, again, the reign of terror basically has taken place with Sisi. It really was like no hold bar. I have the U.S. in my back. There is nothing I can do that could go wrong. So he just can go ahead and terrorize his people, right?
That's exactly right. And at some points, even the Obama administration liked to pretend that, well, we don't really support General Sisi, and this isn't really what we wanted. And those, from my perspective, are just empty words, because you continue to give Sisi $1.6 billion in military aid.
Exactly.
And that speaks louder than any words you have to offer.
Right. So what do you see? Like, there are some there is this example. There was a lawsuit right now going on in the United States by Mohammed Sultan. His family has been under attack. His father was Salah Sultan, has been in prison since 2013 for the event related to President Morsi at the time, and he's actually has been in prison. He's for life. He's in jail for life. But now that his cousins, like 5 of his cousins, have been targeted, the police comes in the middle of the night, and they either take these people, make them disappear for 2 days, and they torture them, whatever. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to sort of cease and desist for this lawsuit. Do you think this lawsuit has really the ability to accomplish something that could be problematic for the regime?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. First, in terms of the lawsuit, I think it's a very important lawsuit. And for human rights activists like myself, we live to see the day when lawsuits like this can be brought. When Human Rights Watch issued the first comprehensive report on the massacre in Rabah Square, we were very careful and worked very hard to identify the government agents involved in making this massacre of over 1,000 people in a single day. Worse than the Tiananmen Square massacre. Bravo, Egypt, you outdid China.
Yes.
We wanted the names of the government agents responsible to be involved. And people would always say to me, what's the point? Why do you do this? And I'll tell you why we did this. Because Hazem Bablawi's name who was the acting prime minister at the time. He was named in our report, and we explained very clearly his role in orchestrating the massacre, overseeing the massacre. And of course, as the person in charge, you're responsible for what happens in your charge, under your command. And now Mohammed Sultan is very lucky that for all the suffering and torture and abuse that he endured in Egyptian prisons, wrongly jailed, brutally tortured, subject to unbelievable psychological horror. He was forced to spend the night in a cell room with a cadaver, to give you one example. That now, when Hazem Bablawi shows up with a cushy job in the IMF, thinking he can live out his years in the comfort and luxury of Virginia suburbs, Mohammed Sultan has his lawsuit to say, you are a torturer, and American law gives me the right to sue you as an international torturer. So that's what this lawsuit is about, and that's why it's very, very important. And that's why the Egyptian government is absolutely terrified, because every single one of those government agents know that if they show up in the United States or any other country in the world that has these sorts of laws of what's called universal jurisdiction, they could be next. And they will be next. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then next year. If not next year. So that's the power of this suit. And that's why the Egyptian government is willing to be as disgusting as taking his family members who have nothing to do with this lawsuit in Egypt hostage,
yes,
to further try to terrorize Mohammed Sultan.
So this, you said you wrote a paper just before we started chatting, about this very thing, which is the repercussions now for all the dissidents that are abroad, the danger that is now representing for their families. What can they do?
Exactly right. I mean, I think that we are in a very novel situation of the emergence of a massive Arab diaspora, particularly since 2011, who are political exiles.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of people, particularly if you count the Syrians, who have fled their countries because of political repression, because of their efforts to resist oppression. And they have successfully, in most cases, found exile in foreign lands, whether it's Canada or the US or Turkey, Sweden, England, France,
yeah,
etc.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are, as many of the Arab diaspora, they are the best source of news and information about what's happening in their countries, including inside Arabia, which has journalists and writers from the Arab world. When people now want to know what's happening in the Arab world, they often know that they are going to rely on people who are independent, but who know their countries.
Right.
But what has been neglected is the reality that these political exiles have a very, very, very difficult time. And they are isolated, they're depressed, they're alone, they've suffered trauma, they've suffered torture, and on top of everything else, they have survivor's guilt, because they're the lucky ones who aren't in jail, who haven't been massacred, and they have to deal with that burden. And we saw recently with the suicide of Sarah Hijazi just how terrible a burden Arab political exiles are feeling. And on top of that emotional, psychological exile and trauma, you have these governments that are still not satisfied. They're still persecuting these people, even after they've left their countries. Whether it's the Saudi government murdering Jamal Khashoggi because he was expressing his voice outside the country, and that was a message to every single Arab and Saudi outside the country, shut up. Whether it's to people they have physically abducted from abroad. Loujain al-Hathloul was kidnapped from the UAE.
Unbelievable. Yes.
Whether it's renewed physical attacks against dissidents. Just 2 weeks ago got a warning from the Canadian police saying your life is in danger. This is a Saudi dissident who was in direct contact with Jamal, of course.
Yes.
These governments are insatiable in their their lust for violence and their lust for terror. And it's scary. And one of the novel ways in which governments have tried to silence the Arab exiles is by continuing to terrorize the remaining family members inside the country. And that's why we've seen Mohammed Sultan's cousins arrested. That's why we've seen the property and assets of many, many Egyptians who fled confiscated, taken away. That's why we've seen the children of former government officials who decided to leave, like in Saudi Arabia, arrested. You know, we're talking teenagers, young kids.
Yeah, incredible.
And to me, what's so shocking about this, what's so upsetting about this, as someone who's in the United States and speaking as an American, it's not that these governments are doing these things.
Yes.
It's our government is supporting them. That's
We're not saying a word about it.
That's
not
right.
saying a word about it.
That's
I mean,
right.
it's truly, I mean, it's like in what's happening in Yemen. It's like everything goes. And it is, they have a green light. Literally, the United States is standing for oppression and repression in those countries.
While it pretends to cry to us about the oppression in Iran and Venezuela.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
know,
actually, absolutely.
Nobody believes you.
Yes.
Nobody believes what Pompeo says about Iran
Yes.
or Venezuela for a second, because it's completely politicized.
Exactly. Well, how do you see where are we going from here? I mean, obviously, we're going to have elections happening in 4 months, but this should be worrying some of those regimes. It should be worrying, the Sisis of this world, that what is going to happen with the change of to the extent possible, because we know that there has been much more continuity than there has been change from one administration to the next, no matter how much they want to. But I think that, again, there is a popular awakening, if you will, of oppression, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or whether it's, about other minority groups, refugees that have been unbelievably mistreated in this country, but also about what's happening overseas. As everything becomes more, we are all aware of what's going on at a global level. I think that perhaps there will be less of a tolerance to this kind of injustice and oppression and aggression, and maybe our next government will sort of put a foot down and say enough is enough.
This is a very complicated question, because on the one hand, I think what the Syrian war in particular may have taught us, or taught activists like myself, is the myth that if people have enough information, if people have enough awareness, if people are awake enough, then things will be different. I think the challenge of our time, the lesson that we've learned with the massive democratization of media, with the fact that we can get citizen journalists from around the world telling us exactly what's happening in Kesab, Syria, exactly what's happening in Idlib. And, some guy sitting in Arkansas knows about Aleppo, right?
Yeah.
That is extraordinary at some level.
It is, yeah.
But still, the atrocities continue. So the one of the big challenges of our time is to recognize that awareness does not equal action and does not equal change.
Especially when our leadership is actually literally, gleeful about repression overseas. They love.
Right.
Literally, we have a president who is applauding.
That's right. So in terms of the upcoming elections, I have no idea. I didn't predict President Trump would be elected in the first place. It caught me by surprise. I'm clearly not in touch and understanding enough of the depths of the thinking of the American electorate. I don't know what will happen in the upcoming election. I do know that what has significantly changed in the United States is the extent to which foreign governments are involved in controlling and influencing, controlling is too strong a word, influencing American elections.
Right.
On the one hand, many observers in the United States or Iran could say, as we say in Arabic, يستاهلوا. They have been meddling in our elections for how long? How many coups? How many overthrows? Now it's our turn.
Yeah.
On the other hand, while we've had long experience and long history of organizations like AIPAC and organizations whose primary interest is supporting Israel, directly influencing American elections through direct finance, campaign contributions.
Exactly.
Now the Saudi Arabias and the UAEs and the Russias are all getting in on the action.
Yes.
And through various ways. But obviously with what we know with Trump, with directly cultivating candidates that they think will be friendly to them. And that is a whole unknown factor. So we already know that American politics has been diseased for a long time because of the influence of money, because of the influence of corporate interests who've stolen our country, and our government officials have allowed themselves to be corrupted. We've known that for a long time. And we've known that in one place in the world, with Israel, the American political system has been corrupted in the same way. Now we're seeing it corrupted across the board to other countries in the Middle East. And of course, we see that it also has repercussions in places like Taiwan or Singapore or Ukraine, where the governments are getting in on the action. Everybody wants a Washington, D.C. political firm, lobbying firm, to lobby with government officials and influence candidates.
America's for sale. It's a big sell.
And I think obviously that's disastrous for the American democracy, and only campaign finance laws will save us from that. But in terms of the Black Lives Matter, one of the points that I've tried to make, and that I think increasingly people are trying to make, and I think the people who tried to make this point first were Palestinian activists and activists who support Palestinian rights. And that is the parallels between racism in the United States and racism in American foreign policy. It's no accident that nearly every country of the 30 plus countries that the United States sanctions are countries where they are people of color.
Absolutely.
It's no accident that the countries the United States invades and throws bombs on and allows massacres and allows proxy forces to operate are in countries of peoples of color. And we have to, as foreign policy analysts and commentators and activists, have to do a better job of showing those linkages to the American public, but especially the American youth, because they get that. They understand fully the racism of the police forces here. We need to make them understand the rotten racism that runs through the course of American foreign policy, not just in the government, by the way, but also in the think tanks and the institutes, which are overwhelmingly
systemic. It's systemic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
I agree. I totally agree with you. I mean, it's really extraordinary to see this. In fact, inside Arabia, we do our share of exposing a lot of this again and again and again. So that's what we need to do. We need to keep talking about it, because silence is just not an option, right? It's not an option. And I think the new generation is much more aware not only of global issues like climate change and racial disparities, but as you said, it will be reflected on foreign policy as well. And the United States is a leader. It's a thought leader. So when our leadership is not there, we are actually, we're failing not just our people, we're failing the entire planet, I think, in just, you know what I mean? I feel like really, maybe it's a little ideological, but I really believe that where the United States stands has a great deal of impact on the rest of the world. I mean, you can just see how it's spread across the world. Those protests, the Black Lives Movement have spread throughout the world. It's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. You're absolutely right about that. And it has caused me pause to think again about what good leadership looks like and what bad leadership looks like. And I have always been a very large critic, strong critic of the bad leadership example that the United States has set, whether with the invasion of Iraq, support for the war in Yemen, military aid to Israel, and so forth, saying, please just do nothing. I prefer you to do nothing. But seeing the power of the American people rising up against discrimination and inspiring people around the world has made me also realize that there's such positive leadership that can be had when it stands for what's good and what's right.
Well, I wanted to just talk a little bit. I wanted to have your ideas, your opinion about this mass graves discovery in Libya. It's very disturbing to me because up to now, we have not heard. I mean, we heard of the trafficking of African migrants in Libya, the literally slave markets that they had in terms of human rights abuses. That's kind of horrific. The Europeans trying to prevent that migration from happening, which of course has sort of created this kind of situation. But now we're having mass graves.
Mhm.
I mean, what does that say? What is going on? What do you suppose is happening there? Where does this come from? Is this the work of some militias, of a group, a particular side?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, unfortunately, we have long documented horrible and grave crimes by General Haftar and the various militias that work for him. And the reason why the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court specifically indicted Mr. Warfali and other accomplices in the massacre of detainees some years ago is because she specifically wanted to send a message to General Haftar and his militias that her prosecution, her investigation into crimes in Libya remains open and did not end with Gaddafi and the crimes that occurred while he was trying to take power. But the warning signs of atrocities by General Haftar and his militias, of course, there have been abuses on all sides, but in particular by Haftar and his militias, are ones that we have tried to alert the international community to for the past several years. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me at all that there's a mass grave and that there may well be others because of what we have documented in terms of indiscriminate killings, torture, executions at the hands of General Haftar and his militias. Again,
not to mention who are his backers. Who are his backers? I mean, Sisi. I mean, President Sisi, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Russians. I mean, all of them are human rights abusers of one kind or another.
Well, but that's right. But again, this is where, unfortunately, the UN Security Council has fallen down. There is a Security Council mandated arms embargo on Libya that is supposed to ban any arms sales to anybody in Libya. That is still in effect. Yet everybody knows, and it is repeatedly and extensively documented, that the UAE not only continues to send arms to Libya, to General Haftar and his militias, but also to have troops based on the ground where itself is carrying out military attacks.
And are they using troops from Sudan also, like some mercenaries that they've been hiring from places like that?
Well, there have been reports, unfortunately, that both sides have used mercenary troops, very, very sadly, and most horrifically, Syrian mercenaries from both sides fighting on both sides. It's just unbelievably tragic. It really breaks my heart to think about that. But that the UN Security Council has done nothing to enforce its own resolution, its own arms embargo, its own a system for avoiding the escalation of the conflict, and they have allowed Libya to become exactly what Syria became, which is a battleground for the big boys, as you were saying earlier, without regard to the human beings there or what they want or what their conflict was even about.
So, Sarah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for thinking of me.
It's been a great pleasure, and I hope we'll do it again.
All right.
You're always welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Have a nice evening, my dear.